Please welcome Mirabai Starr.
Welcome, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. So we're going to begin by just taking a moment to settle into our bodies and into this present moment. I'm going to ring the bell and light a candle and read to you from Mother of God, Similar to Fire, a collaboration I did with Father Bill McNichols on images of Mother Mary with my accompanying prayer poems. So let's first light a candle to invoke sacred space and just welcome us all in. And give thanks. Thanks for this opportunity to be together in this way. Thanks to the ancestors and the invisible advocates that surround us and hold us and guide us. And with gratitude to you for making your way to this moment. All that it took to bring you right here, right now. Deep bow to you for the story of your life. I'm going to ring the bell, and then on the sound of the resonance of this bell, I will read to you a prayer, and I'll show you the image that goes with the prayer. And then we'll just settle in for 1 or 2 minutes of silence and stillness. So this is the book I'll be reading from, Mother of God, Similar to Fire. And this is the image, Nuestra Señora de los Dolores. Our Lady of Sorrows, Nuestra Señora de Dolores. Mother of suffering, you carry the grief of the whole world in your boundless, shattered heart. Please, carry mine. I know that the broken open container of your mother heart has room for us all, for the women of Iraq and Rwanda, Afghanistan and Bosnia, Darfur and Burma, Palestine and Israel, whose innocent children are sacrificed every day as victims of these senseless wars. For parents in Los Angeles and Albuquerque, London and Buenos Aires, whose sons and daughters are killed in sudden car wrecks or die of lingering cancers, or wrestle with the demons of addiction, or languish in prison systems specially designed to breed violence and hatred. Your own sorrow has rendered you invincible, Mother. I cannot bear these losses alone. Please, share them with me. Amen. So allowing ourselves now to just drop into the body, into this present moment. Taking 3 deep, full breaths. Breathing in deeply, holding the in-breath for a few beats, and then exhaling completely and holding the exhalation for a few beats before breathing in again. 3 deep breaths at your own pace, lingering in the empty space, the liminal space between the breaths. And whenever you've taken your 3 deep breaths, simply breathe naturally for a moment, welcoming yourself home to your own dear body in whatever condition you find yourself, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Just be with that. Just welcome that. Resting in the stillness. So we're exploring the connection between loss and longing for God, between the stories of our lives and that kind of alchemical transmutation of those stories into the gold of connection with the whole of the human family. Of course, paradox is the definition, in a way, that the quintessence, let's say, of the mystical path. The longing that opens into union. The shattering of the heart that creates space for everything. Paradox is the invitation to that presence that our hearts yearn for. When we pour the wine of Shabbat, for instance, into the Kiddush cup, the empty goblet, represents that heart that cries out with longing for the divine. And the wine is that instantaneous answering response of love that comes pouring into the empty heart. So we cleave close to the mystery. We stay with unknowing. We find our way in the dark, as St. John of the Cross invites us to do. We choose to be with unknowing. And whenever knowingness starts to pile on, we remove it. We let it go. That's what spiritual practices are. Those are the technologies that help us strip away our opinions on the matter and stay with radical not knowing. I come from a Jewish tradition, non-religious in my parents' case, but nevertheless I carry that heritage of questioning everything, of wrestling with the truth. There's a way in which that very wrestling is what connects us with the sacred truth that abides, that transcends all dogma. And all the mystics that I know and love invite us to inhabit that liminal space, that emptiness, that holy darkness that is outside of all beliefs and belief systems. So today we're walking with the mystics through the landscape of loss. We're claiming and welcoming the human condition not as an obstacle to awakening and to abiding in the presence of the sacred, but as a portal to that intimacy with that which our hearts most deeply yearn for. One of my favorite examples of this path of engaging the human experience as the alchemical fire for transmuting our hearts in connection to the Holy One is Teresa of Avila, Santa Teresa de Avila, the 16th century Spanish mystic who I've had the great privilege of translating. And Teresa, or Teresa, as she's most commonly known in the United States anyway, was a beautiful example of living her humanity to the fullest. Teresa was filled with life, with vida, with duende. She was gregarious, but also contemplative. She was alluring. Everybody fell in love with her. And she also had this great capacity for stillness and solitude. She had skills of psychology and human relations, and also this profound, secret intimacy with the one she called beloved. So when Teresa was 12 years old, her mother died. This was the significant turning point in her early life. Her mother died in childbirth with her 9th child at the age of 33. And after that, Teresa just kind of spiraled out of control. She became a very rebellious teenager, whatever that looked like in 16th century Spain in a noble, privileged family. But it was enough of a scandal, whatever it is that she did, had something to do with a cousin and being caught in the garden. It was enough to warrant being banished to the nunnery. Her father sent her off to an Augustinian convent to receive an education. And she often talked about this scandal. I mean, throughout her life, she used it as an example of how wicked she was and how the adults around her didn't even know a fraction of what she really did, which is how I felt with my teenagers. I knew they were up to things that they would never tell me about, and I still don't know to this day. Maybe you were one of those kids. So off she goes to the nunnery, to the convent, and it is a banishment, but there's something that happens in that place, in that experience, and it has to do with the brief periods of silent prayer, of contemplative practice that happened in the convent during the hours of prayer. Something in her soul said yes to those periods of silent communion when everything became very, very simple and very quiet and very full. And it was enough of an allure for Teresa that she decided that she wanted to become a nun, to everybody's shock and surprise, not least of which was her own surprise that she would be drawn to monastic life because, as she described herself, she didn't have a monastic bone in her body. She was a party girl. She loved to be with people. She loved to be liked. She loved to talk and gossip. And she loved to be the center of attention. But there was a deeper wish in her. You know, I've often contemplated, actually, this desire of Teresa's because it was so counter to her natural personality, which was very much about connecting with other people and having a great time and dancing and laughing. She was very funny. She was very smart. She was the life of the party. Like, why would she want to shut herself up into a basically cloistered monastic situation? There are a couple of possible reasons for this. One is she genuinely was drawn to spiritual practice and to contemplative prayer. The other was that she watched her mom die in childbirth after bearing baby after baby. And the path of marriage and childbearing probably didn't look like something she really wanted to embrace. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Another is that she feared for her soul because she felt like she had this kind of superpower of connecting with people and making everybody like her and getting people to do what she wanted. And that worried her. I mean, she grew up in a religious family where humility, some kind of version of humility imposed upon her by the patriarchy, was what she associated with being holy enough to warrant a ticket to heaven, right? So she feared for her mortal soul, is what she says. And she struggled all her life, in a way, with that kind of masculinized paradigm of holiness. It never fit her spiritual curves. Teresa didn't align with the classic image that she herself inherited of what it means to be spiritual, of what it means to be a saint, of what it means to deserve the rewards, the spiritual rewards. And that struggle in her was enough, I feel, to bring her to the brink of death. So what happened was that Teresa came home from the convent and she said, Padre, Father, to her dad, I think I want to become a nun. Mi hija, said her father, I'm glad you had a great experience at the convent, but now it's time to come home, get married, and have a family. But Teresa, who was admittedly strong-willed, insisted. Her father balked, and she slipped away in the middle of the night and joined the convent without his permission, which was extremely painful for her. She was very attached to her dad, and she said that defying him and going to back to the convent without his permission, it felt like every bone in her body was being pulled apart. But off she went. And over the years, by the way, he became her student in contemplative prayer. Her passion for silent prayer was infectious, and when he would come visit her, she would share these teachings with him. And I love that. But ultimately, what I really want to tell you is that ultimately, the free spirit of Teresa of Avila that could not conform itself to the kind of patriarchal model of monastic life, which was so much about transcending the human experience, the tension in that made her very ill. And so really not long into her life in the convent, she started fainting. She'd have terrible headaches, migraine headaches. and fainting spells, and her joints would be on fire. And she was sick all the time. So finally the abbess called up her dad somehow, contacted her father, and said, "You've got to take her. She's just too much trouble. She's just falling apart." And she became sicker and sicker, and her father was trying desperately to find a cure. He employed every medical professional in Avila, and nobody could get to the bottom of what was causing these fevers and fainting spells and terrible headaches, blinding headaches. So finally, he arranged for her to go to a village where her older sister from his first marriage, who was the sister of his second wife, Teresa's mother, lived. And there was a curandera, a healer in this village. And Teresa went to stay with her and went through a series of cures that did not cure her. She just got worse and worse. Until finally her father took her back to Avila and put her to bed, and she went into a coma. And this went on for 3 days, and finally she stopped breathing. And it seemed that she was dead. And so they laid her out on the bed, and her father sat vigil, and they surrounded her with candles, and they put wax on her eyelids. And the nuns back at the Augustinian convent dug her grave. And as they sat vigil with her body, her father leaning close and weeping, he noticed a little bit of motion in her chest. And he jumped up and he said, "The child is breathing. She lives." And at the sound of his voice and his exaltation, she tried to open her eyes, but they were waxed together. And they realized she was alive. And after that, after they cleared the wax from her eyelids and helped her to sit up, she couldn't feel anything, and she was paralyzed from the neck down. And it took about 6 months, she said, before she could really move again. At first, she said she could only wiggle her finger. So I want to share with you Teresa's own words around what happened as a result of this experience, this near-death experience that she had. So I'm going to read to you from the book of my life, which was her autobiography. And it's one of, I feel, having read gazillions of them, one of the very finest examples of a coming-of-age story of a mystic in her own words. And I had the great joy of translating this work from Spanish to English. She writes, "When I began to get around by crawling on my hands and knees, I praised God. I accepted all this and eventually came to bear my condition with genuine joy. After all, it was a vast improvement over what I went through at first. I had surrendered to the will of God, even if he were to leave me like that forever. I think my greatest wish was that I could get better just so that I could practice solitary prayer again, as I had been taught. It was impossible to be alone in the convent infirmary. I was unwavering in my commitment to confession. I spoke about God constantly and in such a way that everyone I talked to was uplifted and amazed by the patience the Lord had given me. It was obvious that this was a gift from the Beloved's hand, because without it I could not possibly have endured such terrible suffering with such pure contentment. In prayer, God granted me the grace of his mercy. This was a wonderful blessing because it helped me to realize what it is to love him. I began to feel the holy virtues flowing back into me, although, as it turned out, not strongly enough to hold me up in righteousness. I made it my practice to avoid speaking badly of anyone, ever. Whenever I was tempted, I would simply remind myself not to say anything about someone else that I would not want them to say about me. I was uncompromising in my commitment to this value. Of course, I was not perfect, and certain difficult situations came up that strained my resolve to the breaking point. Still, this was my customary way of behaving, and those who spent time with me were so struck by it that they made it their practice too. People realized that when they were with me, they could turn their backs and be perfectly safe. So, Teresa experienced her illness, her brush with death, as an invitation to be true to her deepest values, her deepest human values of kindness and compassion, of deep listening and fierce truth-telling. Teresa of Avila was a fierce truth-teller. She found a way to be fully herself and still flourish in a monastic life. She did join the convent. She did stay there. She ended up founding her own communities and becoming a great reformer, creating the Discalced Carmelite order, founding this order of barefoot Carmelites in honor of the return to the contemplative values that she so cherished, which the mitigated or mainstream Carmelite order had strayed so far from. Values of contemplative prayer, of silence and solitude and voluntary simplicity, but also joyous celebration and song and poetry. These were the hallmarks of the Discalced Carmelite communities. So her suffering, like yours probably, and certainly like mine, became an opening to these spaces of connection to the whole of the human family. It interestingly took many more years, really 20 more years, of in fact becoming the abbess of her own convent before Teresa had what she considered to be her first true spiritual experience, when her heart broke open with love and longing, that she had in many ways emotionally kept herself aloof from her own humanity for those first 20 years in community life, until one day she came across a statue of Christ being scourged at the pillar that was just lying in the convent hallway. Someone had put it there in preparation for a festival. And she saw it. She leaned down, bent down to pick it up, to move it to where it was supposed to be. And she caught the eyes, the gaze of her beloved, and saw in his countenance this admixture of suffering and unconditional love, and saw him and beheld him beholding her in that moment in such a way that it broke her open. This is what's known as Teresa's second conversion. And she found herself on the floor weeping. She writes about it beautifully in her life story. And she demanded, because she was very demanding, I am not going to move from this spot, fully prostrate on the stone floor of the convent hallway. I am not getting up until you can promise me that this love that is flowing through me right now will never leave me, that I will always love you this much. And her beloved kept his promise, and that's when her unrelenting visions and voices and raptures and ecstasies began. But I want to end this section by saying that those dramatic spiritual experiences for which Teresa of Avila is so famous, her visions of the angel plunging the flaming sword into her core, for instance, what's known as the transverberation. The Bernini statue depicts this famous vision. And all the locutions, the voices that she heard, all of those visionary experiences ultimately and eventually fell away. And what she came to is a life of service, of what is known in the Hindu tradition as seva, selfless loving service, where every act became an offering to the divine. And I think that's true for so many of us, that we experience early in our spiritual lives some kind of opening, some cracking open, some perhaps shattering experience. And into that opening flows this tremendous sense of the presence of the divine, and it fills us. And ultimately, we integrate those experiences in such a way that the only thing that makes sense anymore is to step into loving, compassionate action in the world. And Teresa of Avila was such a beautiful example of that unfolding. So another mystic I love, who had a near-death experience as a result of trying to conform herself to some idea of holiness rather than her own authentic experience of spirit living in her own body, is Hildegard of Bingen, the medieval Rhineland visionary. Hildegard was the 9th of 9 children, and the Rhineland custom was that the 9th child was given over as a tithe to God. A tithe to God. So at age 9, Hildegard was sent to live with a distant cousin who was an anchoress named Jutta in her anchor hold in a remote part of the Rhineland countryside, and to study a life of prayer with Jutta, who had this reputation for great sanctity. And Hildegard took to monastic life at a really young age, to contemplative life. She learned to read in Latin, to recite the Psalms, and she flourished in her life with her holy cousin Jutta and became a leader in her own right. Women would come. It wasn't a totally cloistered situation. These two women lived in the anchor hold, but other women came to study with them, to pray with them. And Hildegard was very happy in this setting. But she had a secret. And Hildegard's secret was that when she was a little girl, around 5 years old, she says, she began to know things, to see things and hear things from the other world, which she didn't realize was an other world. And she was told practical things like the color and positioning of the spots of a calf that was yet to be born. But she also knew things about the adults and their secrets that she would tell to her parents, for instance. And this didn't go over very well with the grown-ups in Hildegard's world. 1, because they didn't want their secrets to be exposed, and 2, because how do you know these things? She could see that her knowing scared them. And so she repressed what she knew, her clairvoyant experiences, and kept them to herself and kept all of these things secret for all those years. And yet that knowingness kept breaking through to the point where her effort to repress this experience of knowingness that was rising up in her made her ill. She kept beating it down. And the more she pressed down the visions and the voices that were beginning to come through, the more her own body broke down, until she, like Teresa, came to the brink of death. She became very, very ill, and while she was in her fever state in bed, she heard a voice that began to boom through her being saying, "Get up and write down what I tell you. Speak and write what I say to you." And this voice was accompanied by a blinding light. So Hildegard probably experienced migraines throughout her life because the visions and voices that came through her were often accompanied by blinding headaches and brilliant luminosity that was too much to bear, a radiance that was blinding. So somehow she managed to do what she was told, and she rose up from her bed and she called for a parchment and a quill and a pot of ink, and she began to write. And she wrote down what she was hearing, what was being told to her. Hildegard's experience always reminds me of the Prophet Muhammad, who also experienced a voice saying, "Speak and write," or recite. And Muhammad was illiterate, so he didn't understand this command that was coming from the angel Gabriel, actually in his case, to write down what he told him. And Hildegard, although she was literate, didn't understand what she was being asked to do until she set to work. Hildegard also understood that the only thing to be done was to do what she was told by the voice that she came to know as the living light. So I want to read to you a little bit of Hildegard's experience of this living light coming through her in this time of illness, in her own words. And this is from Sivia's, her first account of the visions and voices that she received, by the way, at the age of approximately 40, which was also around the age Teresa was when she had that second conversion in the convent hallway. And it was also the approximate age of Francis of Assisi. He was actually 44 when he received the stigmata. And behold, in the 43rd year of my passing course, while I was intent upon a heavenly vision with great fear and tremulous effort, I saw a great splendor in which a voice came from heaven, saying to me, "O weak mortal, say and write what you see and hear. But because you are fearful in speaking and simple in explaining and unlearned in writing these things, say and write them not according to human speech, nor the understanding of human creativity, nor according to the will of human composition, but according to this rule, that you reveal by interpreting the things you see and hear among heavenly matters from above in the wonders of God. Just as also a hearer receiving his teacher's words makes them known according to the tenor of his speech, as he wishes, shows, and teaches. So then, you also, O mortal, speak the things you see and hear, and write them, not according to yourself or any other person, but according to the will of the one who knows, sees, and disposes all things in the hidden places of his mysteries. And again I heard a voice saying to me, "Therefore speak these wonderful things and write them in the manner they are taught." This happened in AD 1141, when I was 42 years and 7 months old. A fiery light of the greatest flashing brightness, coming out of a cloudless sky, flooded my entire mind, and so inflamed my whole heart and my whole breast like a flame, yet was not blazing, but glowing hot, as the sun makes anything on which its rays fall hot. And so this living light became Hildegard's most intimate companion. And the living light was the source of all of her visions and all the wisdom that came through her, and the illuminations that she painted, and the ecstatic music that she wrote, which we still sing today. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the exalted, beautiful, angelic music that Hildegard composed. So she became a writer, a wisdom teacher, a cosmologist, a psychotherapist, and a healer. Hildegard was given all of these remedies by the living light that had practical application. She healed everything from the pain of menstrual cramps to incurable diseases, seemingly incurable diseases. Hildegard was able to cure or to at least ease and create quality of life for people who suffered. She had an apothecary. People came from all over the Rhineland Valley to be healed by Hildegard. She used herbs, she used stones and minerals and crystals. She was a Renaissance woman before the Renaissance. And all of this, she felt, came to her through her intimacy with the living light. Once she said yes to these gifts that were coming through her, she became a gift to the world. And 1,000 years later, we are still benefiting from the great wisdom teachings and angelic music and living example of this great wisdom keeper, Hildegard of Bingen. So a millennium after her death, Hildegard's wisdom still resounds with as much relevance as it did in her time. This is why these mystics, for me, and maybe for you too, feel as alive and present as people in our midst who are close to us. People like Teresa of Avila and Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich and so many others feel like family to me. They feel like my closest, most intimate companions. They still have so much to share that makes life better and fuller and richer and opens a kind of connection to the sacred that is ever present. So I'd like to read a passage from a letter that Hildegard wrote to one of the nuns in her care. See if this resonates with you. So, O daughter, the world is in flux. Listen now, my anxious daughter. The arrogant deception of the ancient serpent sometimes wearies those persons inspired by God. For whenever that serpent sees a fine jewel, he hisses and says, "What is this?" And he wearies that jewel with the many afflictions that distress a blazing mind longing to soar above the clouds, as if they were gods, just as he himself once did. Listen again. Those who long to complete God's works must always bear in mind that they are fragile vessels, for they are only human. They can only sing the mysteries of God like a trumpet, which only returns a sound, but cannot function unassisted, for it is another who breathes into it, that it might give forth a sound. O my daughter, may God make you a mirror of life. I too cower at the puniness of my mind, and am greatly wearied by anxiety and fear. Yet, from time to time, I resound a little, like the dim sound of a trumpet from the living light. So the third and final example of a mystic who is walking the path of her humanity with such fullness that the example of her life reverberates today is Julian of Norwich, the 14th century English mystic who lived most of her life as an anchoress enclosed in an anchor hold attached to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, from which her name is derived. We don't actually know what her original name was. Her life is quite mysterious because she doesn't write about herself and nobody wrote about her, except for a few clues that she gives us at the beginning of her book, Revelations of Divine Love, or The Showings of Julian of Norwich. What we know is that Julian lived during the time of the plague, as many of us are still experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the changes and all of the suffering that causes. In Julian's time, it's estimated that approximately 50% of the population of Europe died of the plague, which means, of course, that roughly half of the people that Julian knew and loved also most likely died. So at the beginning of her book, Revelations of Divine Love, which is an account of a series of 17 visions she had in a near-death experience, she tells us that she was 30 years old, that she pretty much had nothing left to live for. She wasn't interested in continuing this life. And she was struck by an illness that had no explanation. It wasn't the plague, and yet she was dying. She was so ill, and it was so clear that her death was imminent, that her mother, who's the only other person she really mentions, calls for the priest to come and administer last rites. She's becoming paralyzed, like Teresa of Avila. She no longer can feel her body. And her eyes are starting to roll back in her head, and her vision has become dim. So the priest shows up and holds a crucifix above Julian's face and says, "Gaze into the eyes of your beloved Christ, and you'll go straight to heaven as you take your last breaths gazing at him." And so Julian forces her eyes, which she says have already rolled back in her head, she forces her eyes to focus on Christ on the crucifix. And everything falls away, everything becomes dark. But then there's this light that begins to emanate from Christ and surrounding him and radiating from him. And he begins to speak to her. And so unfolds this series of teachings that Christ gives to Julian about the nature of human life, about the purpose of suffering to connect us more closely with God, about the ultimate loving, unconditionally merciful nature of the Holy One. And finally, Christ reveals himself as Christ the Mother. This unconditionally loving motherhood of God becomes the one true thing that Julian can rely upon. Julian's the first woman to write in vernacular English, in the English language. She was a contemporary of Chaucer. And the showings, or the revelations of divine love, are so beautiful and folksy and colloquial and human, the way that Julian expresses herself, much like Teresa of Avila does, in just a very accessible human language. But I thought I would read to you a little bit of Julian in her own words about the unconditional loving nature of Christ the Mother, or the motherhood of God. And so, Christ Jesus, who does good over evil, is our true mother. He is the source of all motherhood, and we have our being from him, protected by all the sweet love that endlessly accompanies motherhood. As truly as God is our Father, just as truly is God our Mother. She demonstrates this most clearly when she says, "It is I." What she means is, I am the power and goodness of the fatherhood. I am the wisdom and loving kindness of the motherhood. I am the light and grace of all blessed love. I am the threefold nature of the divine. I am unity. I am the supreme goodness in every kind of thing. I am the one who causes you to love. I am the one who causes you to yearn. It is I, the endless fulfillment of all desire. And a little later she says, and so, by participating in our creation, Jesus is our true mother in nature. And by taking on our created human nature, he is our mother in grace. All the loving acts and sweet natural tasks of motherhood belong to the second person of the Trinity. From her own great goodness, she endows us with divine will and keeps it safe and whole forever. I saw 3 ways to look at the motherhood of God. The first is that she created our human nature. The second is that she took our human nature upon herself, which is where the motherhood of grace begins. And the third is motherhood in action, in which she spreads herself throughout all that is, penetrating everything with grace, extending to the fullest length and breadth, height and depth, all one love. So there are a couple of revolutionary things about Julian's showings, the teaching she was given by her beloved Christ. One of them is that although she says she tried very hard to understand the nature of sin, she could see no sin in the loving heart of Christ. Not one iota, she says, of blame for anything that we do as human beings. She could only see the woundedness of the human condition as the source of suffering. So there is no sin. Revolutionary. The other revolutionary aspect, to me, of Julian's teachings is this unconditional, loving motherhood of God. So for each of these mystics, the human condition is an opening into the unconditional, extravagant tenderness of a loving God. Teresa of Avila had a hard time kind of conforming her curves, her spiritual curves, to fit the shape of a kind of patriarchal religious model. And so she found another way. Hildegard of Bingen grew weary to the point of death of repressing the living light that was flowing up and out of her and into the world. And so finally she surrendered, and everything, all these great gifts came flowing through. Julian of Norwich was probably dying of a broken heart. As a fellow bereaved parent myself, I know that feeling of wanting to die when your child dies. And something in me is virtually certain that Julian was a mother who lost probably her husband and at least one child to the plague. But for each of these great mystics and for each of us, there is an opportunity to allow the breaking of the heart to break us open, all the way open, so that grief and loss, illness and even death become portals to that sacred landscape, to the very connection that we most deeply yearn for. For me, death has been one of the greatest teachers. I've had a lot of death in my life. Maybe you have too. Some of us seem to carry an inordinate number of death stories in our personal history. When I was 7, my older brother Matty died of a brain tumor. He was 10. And I watched the way his death unraveled and rewove the fabric of our whole family. And rewove us in love, in deeper, more profound love. But I think that experience at 7 was my first taste of the numinous. Except insofar as all children are still so close in a way to the realm of spirit that it's not like we've drifted too far away from our source, but I do recall vividly this sense of being broken into this space of holiness in the wake of Maddie's death. When I was 14 years old, my first love was killed in a gun accident, Philip. And that heartbreak of first love and losing first love in that way started me on my spiritual path. That's when I started meditating, and that's when I met the great spiritual teacher Ram Dass and started following him around, ultimately dropping out of high school to kind of do the spiritual circuit instead of sex, drugs, and rock and roll like all my peers. And then, as many of you know, when I was 40, my daughter Jenny, my 14-year-old daughter, was killed in a car accident. Jenny died actually the day that my first book of now a dozen books, but my very first book came out, which was a translation of Dark Night of the Soul by the 16th century mystic, Spanish mystic John of the Cross, who was Teresa of Avila's protege in many ways. And John of the Cross, of course, gave us this teaching about the transformational power of suffering, of what happens when we're stripped of everything that stands between our hearts and a direct experience of the sacred. And so I think that we all have moments more or less dramatic in our lives when, by virtue of external circumstances, such as the pandemic, such as loss, death, in my case, a recent diagnosis and complete healing from melanoma, which rocked the foundation of my world and is in the process of kind of remaking me as we speak. I am completely cancer-free, but the spiritual effects of that diagnosis and that period of waiting to find out, and the ultimate deep changes in my inner life that are happening, are still unfolding and still bearing fruit that I have yet to taste, I know. But all of these experiences of embodiment are ways that we share in the human condition, right? Rather than rendering us special because of what's happened to us, our stories, when completely embraced and welcomed, well, maybe not even completely, sometimes reluctantly, connect us to that web of interbeing to which we all belong, and we can recognize that welcoming if we pause to be present with what is, when all our conditioning teaches us to get away from what is. But these great mystics, like the 3 that I've shared with you today, serve still as living exemplars of saying yes to life, of welcoming our participation in the human condition that connects us to each other and to that which is the source of all life, of all love. So I'd like to end by reading just a little bit from Julian of Norwich. Julian writes, "Everything I say about myself here, I mean to apply to all spiritual seekers. For God has made it clear to me that He gave me these showings for the good of everyone. And so I implore you, for God's sake, and I advise you for your own benefit, to disregard the humble servant to whom this revelation was shown and direct your attention to the one who revealed it. Contemplate your beloved with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength. In His gracious love and goodness, He desires that this vision be a comfort to us all. This revelation does not make me a better person. I am only better if I love God better. And if it makes you love God better, the vision is more for you than for me. I am not saying this to those of you who are wise, for you already know it well. But as for those who are simple, like me, you may draw comfort and strength from this account. We are all one in love. It is clear to me that God does not favor me above the simplest soul who dwells in a state of grace. I am sure there are many people who have never had visions and yet love God far better than I do. When I look at myself as an individual, I see that I am nothing. It is only in unity with my fellow spiritual seekers that I am anything at all. It is this foundation of unity that will save humanity." Thank you.